They thought he was just another drifter until they kicked his German shepherd. In that moment, the entire diner learned the truth. They weren't bullying a helpless stranger. They were provoking a former SWAT operative, and justice was about to hit back harder than the winter storm outside. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe for more. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. A steel gray sky hung low over Cold River as winter suffocated the town beneath a freezing 28-degree stillness. The cold was not merely weather, it was a presence, an ancient, heavy creature that pressed its weight on every rooftop, every frosted window pane, every breath drawn through a scarf. Ethan Brooks felt it settling into his bones the moment he pushed open the door of the roadside diner, a tired structure with warped wooden siding and a neon sign that buzzed like a dying cicada. Ethan, 57, moved with the deliberate calm of a man who had spent half his life in rooms where one wrong step meant a folded flag delivered to a grieving family. He had the kind of face carved by survival, strong jaw dusted with 2 days of gray stubble, deep-set eyes the color of storm clouds, faint scars near his temple, and brow from missions no one would ever read about. His hair, steel silver, cropped short, bristled beneath his wool cap. His broad shoulders carried the weight of countless choices that had saved lives but stolen sleep. Though retired from SWAT, he carried himself with the quiet discipline of a man who would never entirely lay down his vigilance. At his heel walked Shadow, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a muscular build and dense black and tan coat that shimmered under the diner lights like polished obsidian streaked with amber. Shadow's ears stood tall and alert, his amber eyes unblinking, scanning every table with the intelligence and loyalty that only a dog trained for danger could possess. A faint scar ran along the dog's left hind leg, a reminder of a winter mission they had survived together. The dog's gait was fluid, purposeful, always half a step behind Ethan, as if tethered by an invisible thread woven from devotion and shared trauma. The diner's interior smelled of burnt coffee, grilled onions, and old linoleum scrubbed too many times with lemon cleaner. Behind the counter stood Sarah Nolan, the diner's owner and lone waitress on morning shifts. She was in her mid-40s, tall and willow-slender with pale skin flushed pink from working beside the griddle, and auburn hair tied into a loose braid that curled from the humidity of boiled coffee pots. Her hazel eyes carried a gentleness tinged with fatigue, the look of someone who had weathered too many long winters alone. She offered Ethan a smile, one that said both welcome and apology for the state of the town. "You two just passing through?" she asked, her voice soft but warm, like a wool blanket warmed by firelight. "For now," Ethan replied, removing his gloves. His voice, deep and steady, held the rasp of someone who didn't speak unless necessary. "Anywhere you like," Sarah said, nodding to the empty booths. Ethan chose a corner booth where he could sit with his back to the wall and eyes toward the entrance. Shadow settled under the table, resting his chin on Ethan's boot. Here, in the dim hum of the diner, Ethan allowed himself a rare moment of ease. The weight in his chest loosened, if only slightly. But peace was never a long-lived guest in his world. Through the frosted front windows, Ethan saw headlights approaching, 3 sets weaving through the blowing snow like predators circling prey. Sarah's face tightened as she noticed them too. She didn't need to say a word. The fear in her eyes was enough. The door swung open with a violent jangle of the bell, letting in a blast of Arctic air. 3 uniformed officers entered, stamping snow from their boots with arrogance instead of necessity. Leading them was Lieutenant Colby Marston, a man whose reputation slithered through Cold River like a winter sickness. Marston stood around 40, thick-set but not muscular, a body grown from intimidation rather than discipline. His face was broad, with a square jaw covered in an uneven scruff that suggested vanity without effort. His blonde hair was shaved close on the sides, longer on top, swept back with excessive gel. But his most unsettling feature was his eyes, ice blue, sharp, always searching for weakness. A predator's gaze. Marston thrived on the town's fear. People whispered he controlled everything from late-night patrols to local businesses, all under the protection of a crooked sheriff who owed him too many favors. They called him Winter's Ghost, not for stealth, but because when he appeared, warmth vanished. Behind him were Deputy Reeve Harper and Deputy Boyd Turner, two men who mirrored Marston in loyalty but lacked his intelligence. Reeve, early 30s, tall and lean with a narrow face and a nose slightly crooked from too many bar fights, wore an expression of constant irritation. Boyd, heavier and younger, perhaps mid-20s, had a round, flushed face and short brown hair plastered under his cap, his movements stiff and unsure. They walked like shadows mimicking their master, always waiting to please him. "Morning, Sarah," Marston said, though the way he said her name made it sound like an intrusion instead of a greeting. Sarah forced a polite smile. "Coffee's fresh." "Good," he replied. "We'll help ourselves." Ethan didn't move, didn't even blink, but every instinct sharpened, coiling tight inside him. Shadow sensed it too. His ears twitched, his breath slowed, his tail lowered. Marston scanned the diner lazily until his gaze landed on Ethan. A stranger. Someone he didn't recognize, someone not yet conditioned by fear. Marston's smile twisted. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like we've got company today." He sauntered toward Ethan's booth with heavy, deliberate footsteps, each thud echoing like a gavel. Reeve and Boyd lingered behind him, curiosity mixing with malice. Ethan didn't shift. His calm was iron-forged, but inside, the familiar tension of pending danger curled in his stomach. Not fear, but readiness. Marston stopped beside the booth. "You hiding a dog under there, old man?" Shadow's amber eyes glinted, but he didn't growl. "Not yet." "He's not hiding," Ethan said. "He's resting," Marston snorted. "Town ordinance says no animals inside food establishments." "No ordinance exists in this county banning service animals," Ethan replied, voice steady. Marston's jaw tightened. He despised being corrected, especially by someone who did it calmly. He turned fully toward Ethan, stepping uncomfortably close. "What's your name, stranger?" "Ethan Brooks." "You passing through?" "For now." "Maybe don't pass too slow," Marston said, leaning in. "Cold River has rules." Ethan held his gaze with the cold of a glacier. "Rules keep people safe. Control keeps people afraid." Sarah froze mid-step nearby. Reeve shifted nervously. Boyd swallowed hard. No one talked to Marston like that. Marston's smile died. A cruel glint sparked in his eyes. Without warning, he reached behind him for the metal pot Sarah had set aside minutes earlier, steam rising faintly from its spout. In one swift motion, he tipped it downward, spilling a thin stream of scalding water toward Shadow's front paws. The moment stretched, slow, painful, crystalline. Shadow jerked back, ears flattening, eyes flashing with a pain he didn't voice, trained to silence even under distress. Ethan's breath hitched so subtly no one else would have noticed, but inside, something ancient and dangerous unfurled, the part of him forged in dust, fire, and cold metal decisions. Shadow looked up at Ethan, waiting for permission, always waiting. Marston laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. Just checking his reflexes. Ethan's eyes, storm gray and depthless, lifted to meet Marston's. The diner's fluorescent lights reflected off them like lightning off dark waves. There was no anger, no outburst, only a lethal quiet, the kind that settled seconds before a winter avalanche. Marston didn't recognize the danger, but Sarah did. Her hand trembled around a coffee mug. Something in her expression, a silent plea, kept Ethan anchored for the moment. "You done?" Ethan asked, his voice soft, controlled. Marston blinked, thrown off by the lack of fear. "What did you say?" "I asked," Ethan repeated evenly, "if you're done." Reeve and Boyd stiffened behind Marston, sensing the shift but not understanding it. Marston took a step back, but only to hide the micro-flinch in his posture. "Watch yourself, Brooks. This is my town." But Ethan knew better. Men like Marston never owned anything. They only borrowed power from those too afraid to challenge them. And something told Ethan that fear's reign was nearly over. For now, he let Marston walk away, boots thudding triumphantly against the worn floor. But the storm gathering inside Ethan Brooks was no ordinary winter storm. It was a reckoning. The forest outside Cold River had a way of swallowing sound, muffling even the howl of the winter wind beneath heavy drifts of snow. Ethan Brooks moved through the pines with steady, measured steps, the soles of his boots sinking into the powder as if the earth itself were reluctant to let him go. He had chosen a small clearing, shielded by tall evergreens as his temporary camp, a place where the world seemed frozen in time and the sky above flickered with muted auroras hidden behind thinning clouds. Ethan worked with practiced efficiency, setting up his compact winter tent, its dark fabric nearly blending into the night. Frost clung to his beard, outlining the shape of his jaw. His breath came out in controlled clouds, not from fatigue but from the focus of someone who was shifting from the rhythm of civilian life into a familiar, darker mode, mission state. Shadow walked a tight circle around the campsite, nose lifted, scanning scents. Even in the bitter cold, the German shepherd held himself tall, fur thickened to shield against the wind. His black and tan coat bristled with sharp lines of muscle, and his amber eyes glittered like two burning embers against the pale forest. At 5 years old, Shadow was at peak strength, mature, disciplined, tuned to Ethan's every gesture. When Shadow finally settled beside the tent, Ethan knelt, taking out the small military-grade harness from his pack. It was matte black, built with lightweight armor plating and fitted with a discreet mount for a micro-camera roughly the size of a matchbook. Ethan's fingers lingered on the harness a moment. This piece of equipment wasn't just a tool, it was a memory of operations he had carried out under cover of night in countries where winter was a lesser enemy compared to the men hunting them. He fitted the harness over Shadow's shoulders with slow, steady movements. "Easy, boy," he murmured. His voice, though low, carried something warm, something human that rarely surfaced since his retirement. Shadow leaned into him slightly, as if acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Ethan checked the straps, the camera alignment, and the transmitter embedded in the collar. Everything was functional, even in the dangerous cold. Before initiating the mission, Ethan lit a small camp stove inside a windbreak he built from fallen branches. The flame glowed faintly on his face, deepening the lines etched by grief, service, and choices that never fully healed. He rubbed his hands together, staring into the fire. His mind replayed Marston's smirk, the thin stream of scalding water falling onto Shadow's paw, the cold amusement in the lieutenant's eyes. Ethan had seen men like him, men who believed fear was their birthright. Ethan knew another truth. Tyrants only flourish where silence is allowed to grow. When the last light vanished from the sky, Ethan stood. The boughs above him creaked under the weight of fresh snow. Somewhere, in the dark distance, a wolf howled, its voice swallowed quickly by the storm building beyond the ridge. Ethan signaled Shadow with 2 short clicks of his tongue. Shadow straightened instantly, ears pricked, posture shifting from companion to operative. "Work," Ethan said softly. Shadow moved into the night with silent precision, his paws pressed lightly into the snow, almost weightless, leaving only faint marks behind. Ethan followed several paces back, keeping low, keeping quiet. The two moved like echoes, Shadow leading, Ethan shadowing his shadow. They approached the edge of town where old warehouses and loading bays huddled together like forgotten bones. Dim orange lights flickered through the falling snow, revealing 3 figures near a patrol SUV. One of the new figures was Jonas Hale, a trucker in his late 40s with a rugged frame and a permanent slump in his shoulders. His face was round but worn, with dark stubble and deep lines etched around his eyes, evidence of years spent on icy roads hauling goods through storms. His thick brown jacket was patched at the elbows, his gloves threadbare. Jonas was the kind of man who avoided conflict but never deserved the misfortune that seemed to follow him. Tonight, he was unlucky enough to be caught by Marston's patrol. Colby Marston stood near Jonas, puffing into the cold air with visible irritation. The lieutenant's uniform looked almost too pristine for the freezing wind, as if the world itself refused to stain him. His posture radiated annoyance at even the small effort of standing outside. Meanwhile, Deputy Reeve Harper paced restlessly along the curb, his narrow face twisting with impatience. Deputy Boyd Turner stood a few feet away, arms crossed, trying to look intimidating despite his uncertain shifting from foot to foot. Jonas spoke timidly, rubbing his hands together. "Lieutenant, I told you I wasn't speeding. I just hit a patch of black ice back there." His voice trembled not from cold but fear. Marston smirked, leaning in close to him. "You passed through our inspection point without stopping. That's tampering with an ongoing operation, Jonas." "I didn't see any sign." Marston held up a gloved hand. 500, he said. Cash. Now. Jonas paled. I don't have that kind of money. I haven't even delivered my haul yet. Marston's jaw tightened, his icy blue eyes hardened. Then maybe we escort your vehicle to impound. You'll get it back. Eventually. Shadow captured everything, from Jonas's shaking hands to the malicious amusement in Marston's posture. Ethan watched from the tree line, jaw clenched. He could intervene. He could step in, shut this down. But he needed proof. A single rescue wasn't justice. Cold River needed liberation, not a bandage. Jonas weakly reached into his jacket, pulling out a folded stack of bills. His hand trembled as he passed it to Marston. The lieutenant snatched it with a satisfied hum, stuffing it into his vest. Then another figure appeared. Lyle Drummond, a man in his early 50s with a wiry frame and a face roughened by years of cold wind and engine smoke. He wore a grease-stained parka and carried the perpetual smell of diesel. Lyle was known as a roadside mechanic, quick to fix anything for cash but quicker to look away from wrongdoing if it benefited him. His hair was a messy dark brown streaked with gray, and his narrow eyes darted nervously as he approached, hands deep in his pockets. "You called?" Lyle asked, voice thin, almost swallowed by the wind. Marston gestured at Jonas's truck. "This one might need some attention before it hits the market." Lyle nodded, glancing at Jonas briefly, then back at Marston with an unspoken understanding. Shadow recorded everything, the bribe, the threats, the arrangement. Cold wind hissed through the pine trees behind Ethan as he watched, expression carved from stone. This wasn't authority. It was predation. When Marston dismissed Jonas with a shove, the poor man hurried back into his truck, fumbling with the ignition, desperate to escape. Ethan murmured to himself, "Hang on a little longer, friend. Your nightmare is almost over." Snow thickened, blurring the shapes of buildings into ghostly silhouettes. Marston and Lyle stepped closer to the patrol SUV to finalize their exchange. Shadow moved along the perimeter, slipping between snowbanks like a specter. The camera caught the envelope passing from Lyle's gloved hand to Marston's waiting palm. Ethan tapped a small receiver in his coat pocket, checking the feed. The footage was crisp despite the swirling flurries. Ironclad evidence, more than enough to expose corruption that had rotted the town from its core. Shadow returned to Ethan with a soft crunch of snow. The dog's breath fogged the air, but he held his posture steady, waiting for Ethan's signal. Ethan knelt, resting a gloved hand on Shadow's powerful shoulders. "Good work," he whispered. In the dim light, Shadow's amber eyes glimmered with resolve, but something cold threaded into Ethan's thoughts. A familiar warning whisper from instincts sharpened over decades. Tonight was only the beginning. If Marston suspected he was being watched, the price would be steep. And people like Marston didn't retaliate with paperwork. They retaliated with blood. Ethan stood, looking through the swirling snow toward the town light. Snow fell on Cold River in thick, lazy spirals, the kind that seemed peaceful only from a distance. Up close, it pressed against the town like a muffled warning, swallowing sound, erasing tracks, sealing the world in white silence. By the time Ethan Brooks reached the diner that Sunday morning, the snowfall had grown so dense it blurred the outline of buildings, turning Cold River into a shadowed watercolor beneath winter's heavy brush. Ethan stepped inside with Shadow close at his heel. The warmth hit them immediately. Dry, stale, smelling faintly of frying bacon and aging vinyl booths. Inside, the morning crowd was muted, each person hunched over their meal as if trying to disappear into it. Fear had a way of taking up space, even in a room filled with people. Sarah Nolan looked up from behind the counter. Today, her auburn braid was pulled tighter than usual, and her face held the pale stiffness of someone who'd slept little. Her skin, normally flushed from the steam of coffee machines, was paler than the snowfall outside, and her hazel eyes flickered with worry. She didn't speak, but the brief tightening around her lips conveyed everything. She had expected this. Ethan gave a single nod, both acknowledgement and reassurance, then moved toward the large circular booth near the bay window. The claimed table, the one no local dared approach, the one reserved for a man who believed himself untouchable. Shadow slipped under the table, positioning himself so he faced the entrance. His tail curled around his legs, but his posture remained alert, muscles coiled beneath his thick winter coat. Ethan sat with deliberate calm, removed his gloves, and placed his hands flat on the table, palms relaxed, fingers uncurling slowly. He wanted every set of eyes in this diner to see his stillness. Stillness was more powerful than defiance. Stillness shook tyrants when words could not. A fragile silence settled over the room as patrons realized where Ethan had chosen to sit. A few forks paused mid-air. Someone muttered a prayer under their breath. Even the overhead heater seemed to hum more quietly. 10 minutes later, the bell above the door jangled. Harsh winter air knifed into the diner, and with it came Lieutenant Colby Marston. He stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots, his heavy winter coat dusted with ice crystals that glittered under the fluorescent lights. Behind him came his deputies, Reeve Harper, lean and restless, eyes darting as sharply as a carrion bird's, and Boyd Turner, broad-shouldered but hesitant, his flushed cheeks betraying nerves he tried to hide. Marston's eyes scanned the diner automatically, expecting the usual submissive glances, the lowered heads, the silent acceptance. But then he saw Ethan, sitting in his booth, calm, waiting. A muscle ticked along Marston's jaw, his ice-blue gaze hardened, and a slow, poisonous smile crept across his face, the kind of smile born from entitlement, not humor. He began walking toward Ethan, each step heavy, punctuated by authority he believed invincible. Sarah froze mid-pour, coffee spilling slightly over a cup's rim. A middle-aged man in the corner lowered his newspaper, lips pressed into a tight line. Marston stopped at the edge of the booth, towering over Ethan. His breath smelled faintly of mint gum and something sour underneath. "Morning, stranger," he said, voice low. "You seem to be in the wrong seat." Ethan met Marston's stare without rising. It was empty. The simplicity of the answer infuriated Marston more deeply than defiance would have. Before he could respond, Deputy Reeve Harper, quick-tempered, wiry, and eager to impress, stepped in close to the table. His narrow face twisted into a grin as he looked beneath the booth. "Well, look here," Reeve sneered. "Your mutt's in violation again." Without warning, he drove his boot hard into Shadow's ribs. The sound was small, just a sharp exhale from Shadow, but the effect was immediate. The dog's body tensed like a sprung trap, yet he did not attack. His training held, his loyalty held stronger. His amber eyes lifted toward Ethan, waiting for instruction. Even in pain, discipline anchored him. Ethan's heartbeat changed, not faster, just heavier, like a drum before a storm. Before Ethan could respond, a new voice cut through the tension, a thin, wavering voice. "That's enough," an elderly man said. He stood from a nearby booth with effort. This was Walter Briggs, a retired mail carrier in his late 70s, thin as winter twigs. His skin bore the weathered creases of someone who had spent decades delivering letters in blizzards and thunderstorms alike. His gray hair was wispy, and his small round glasses sat slightly crooked on his nose. His back curved with age, but bravery straightened him in that moment. "You don't kick a dog," Walter said, breath trembling. "Not in a civilized town." Reeve didn't hesitate. He shoved Walter hard with his forearm. The old man stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of a booth, and fell heavily onto the vinyl seat. The impact stole the breath from his chest. Sarah let out a small gasp, but clamped her hands over her mouth, as if silencing herself was the only way to survive. Something inside Ethan cracked, not loudly, not violently, quietly, like the splitting of ice right before it collapses into a roaring break. Ethan rose. He didn't shout. He didn't warn them. His movements were a blur, precise, practiced, mechanical. In a single fluid motion, he disarmed Marston, spun him by the wrist, and drove him face first into the table. The sound of impact echoed through the diner, followed by Marston's strangled grunt. Chairs scraped as patrons flinched back. Reeve reached for his baton, but Ethan shifted, pivoting with minimal effort, slamming Marston to the floor and pinning him with expert leverage. The lieutenant's cheek pressed into the tiles. His fingers twitched uselessly, trapped in a lock that could snap bone if Ethan wished. Shadow remained under the table, frozen in disciplined silence, but his lips quivered with the urge to protect his handler. Deputy Boyd Turner reacted slower than Reeve. His hand trembled as he reached for his firearm, not out of malice but fear. Fear of Marston, fear of losing control, fear of everything crumbling. Reeve drew his weapon too, leveling it at Ethan. "Drop him, now!" Reeve shouted, voice cracking with adrenaline and disbelief. For a moment, the diner felt unreal, time suspended in icy stillness, the air thick with breath and panic. Ethan assessed the angles, the distances, the risks. He could break Marston's arm, he could disable Reeve, but a stray bullet could hit Walter or Sarah or even Shadow. Violence would not free Cold River. Only truth would. Ethan released Marston slowly, deliberately. Then he raised his hands, palms open, letting the deputies interpret it as surrender. "I'm not resisting," he said calmly. "Do what you have to do." Reeve lunged forward, cuffs clattering in his shaking hands. He grabbed Ethan's wrists with more force than necessary, snapping the metal shut. Boyd grabbed Ethan's other arm and yanked him upright, though his eyes betrayed uncertainty. Shadow growled, a deep, controlled warning, but Ethan gave a soft command. "Stay." The dog fell silent, but his amber eyes burned with restrained fury. Marston staggered to his feet, red-faced and humiliated. The holding corridor beneath the Cold River Sheriff's substation felt more like the bowels of an abandoned mine than a functioning law enforcement facility. The air was frigid and metallic, carrying the faint bite of rust mingled with disinfectant. The concrete walls, painted a sickly beige decades ago, had begun to peel into flakes that curled like dead leaves on a frozen sidewalk. Fluorescent bulbs flickered above Ethan Brooks as he was marched down the hall, their erratic buzzing matching the uneven tempo of Deputy Reeve Harper's breathing behind him. Ethan walked with controlled steps despite the pressure of the handcuffs biting into his wrists. His posture was straight, balanced, the posture of a man who had endured far worse than a local jail. The cold didn't bother him. He had fought through winters harsher than this, storms that swallowed mountains. But what pressed into his chest now was not fear, it was calculation. The trap was closing. And he had built it himself. Shadow had been dragged away earlier, taken by Boyd Turner, hands trembling, face pale, toward the station's kennels. Boyd was conflicted, that much was clear. Unlike Reeve or Marston, he didn't possess cruelty by instinct. Instead, he possessed fear, and men ruled by fear often clung desperately to orders even when their conscience flinched. Reeve unlocked the interrogation room, a square windowless chamber barely large enough for the metal table bolted to the floor. The air was colder here, as if the room inhaled warmth and never exhaled it back. The two-way mirror on the wall was dark, reflecting Ethan in sharp, harsh lines. Deputy Reeve Harper shoved him into the chair with more force than necessary. Reeve's narrow face and crooked nose were flushed from exertion, and his dark eyes carried a restlessness that came from needing control, from wanting to impress someone like Marston. His jaw twitched as he threaded the handcuffs through the steel loop welded to the table. "Don't get any ideas," he muttered. Ethan didn't respond. He simply watched Reeve with quiet, unsettling stillness, the same way he had watched warlords who thought themselves untouchable right before their empires collapsed. Moments later, Lieutenant Colby Marston strode into the room. His winter coat had been removed, revealing his uniform stretched tightly across his broad chest. His blonde hair, slicked back with gel earlier that morning, was now disheveled from the scuffle, and a small cut above his eyebrow pulsed with a crusting line of red. His face was blotched with humiliation. Behind him stood Deputy Carla Mendez, a woman in her early 40s with sharp cheekbones, deep brown skin, and tightly curled black hair pulled back into a practical twist. Her dark eyes held exhaustion, the kind born from years of working in a broken system. Unlike Reeve, Mendez didn't seem to enjoy Marston's authority, but neither did she challenge him openly. Her hands were clasped behind her back, fingers tapping subtly, betraying nerves she wouldn't voice. She was new to this story, but her internal conflict was already etched across her posture. Marston closed the door behind him with a low thud and leaned back against it, arms crossed. A cruel grin stretched across his lips. "You made quite a mess this morning, Brooks." Ethan kept his expression blank. "I sat down for breakfast," Marston barked a humorless laugh, "and assaulted an officer, pinned me like I was some rookie." He stepped closer, the veins in his neck bulging. "People need to know their place in Cold River." "Fear," Ethan said calmly, "is not order." Marston's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed. ice blue hardening into something brittle and dangerous. He paced slowly around the table, the sound of his boots scraping against the concrete filling the narrow room. "You think you're some kind of hero?" Marston asked. "Coming into my town, stirring things up?" Ethan stayed silent. Silence was more effective than argument. Silence forced men like Marston to reveal themselves. Marston's jaw worked as he reached for the baton clip to his duty belt. It was a collapsible steel baton, the kind that extended with a sharp snap. He flicked it open with a swift motion, the metallic ring echoing off the walls. Mendez's fingers tightened subtly at the sound, though she said nothing. Reeve looked thrilled. Marston leaned over the table, baton resting in his palm. "I could break your hand right now," he said softly. "You embarrassed me. My deputies saw it. The town will hear about it. That can't go unanswered." Ethan watched him with the patience of a mountain. His heartbeat remained steady. His breath did not quicken. "And your dog," Marston continued, gaze twisting into something darker. "Once we're done here, I'll see how tough he is without you there to give him commands." Something cold slid through Ethan's veins, not fear, but purpose. He could feel Shadow somewhere beyond these walls, pacing the concrete kennel, waiting. Their bond was something Marston would never comprehend. Ethan exhaled once, slow. Then he said the sentence that froze the room more completely than the winter outside. "Before you swing that baton," Ethan said, voice low and steady, "you should know that Shadow's camera has been live streaming to a federal military server for the last hour, and I haven't entered my safety code." Marston blinked. The baton hovered midair. "What the hell are you talking about?" Ethan shifted just enough for the overhead light to catch the steel glint in his eyes. "If I don't verify my status within 30 minutes, the system triggers a breach protocol. The footage goes directly to federal authorities. They know where I am. They know who you are. And they know everything that's happened tonight." Deputy Mendez inhaled sharply. Reeves. Excitement drained from his face. Marston's lips twitched. "You're lying." "You think that," Ethan said, "because you've never faced consequences. But you should ask yourself one thing." He leaned forward slightly, voice like sharpened frost. "If I were lying, why would I be so calm?" A cold beat of silence followed. Then, faint but unmistakable, came the sound of rotors in the distance, deep, heavy, growing louder, helicopter rotors, not one, several. Marston spun toward the mirror as if it could explain the noise. A second sound followed, engines, large ones, grinding through snow, the rumble of armored tires. Deputy Reeve Harper swallowed hard. "Lieutenant," Marston said nothing. His pale skin turned almost translucent as the walls seemed to tremble. The hallway outside erupted with shouting, voices raised in commands, boots thundering, doors slamming open. Deputy Mendez took an involuntary step closer to Ethan, not out of solidarity, but instinctive recognition that the balance of power had shifted. The interrogation room door burst open. Standing in the doorway was Special Agent Roland Thorne, a man in his early 50s with a square, granite-carved jaw, peppered beard trimmed tightly against wind-chapped skin, and slate-gray eyes that missed nothing. His heavy tactical coat bore patches identifying him as federal law enforcement, and his presence filled the room like a storm front. He was flanked by state troopers in winter gear and 2 members of a federal tactical response team. Behind him stepped Judge Miriam Calloway, a woman in her early 60s with smooth silver hair pinned neatly at the back of her head and a face lined not by age but by authority. Her brown eyes were sharp and unyielding, framed by gold-rimmed glasses that seemed to magnify her disappointment. Her charcoal overcoat contrasted with the soft gleam of a pearl brooch pinned to her collar, a symbol of dignity she earned through decades of defending the law. Judge Calloway surveyed the room in silence. When her gaze fell on Marston, he instinctively dropped the baton. "Lieutenant Colby Marston," she said, voice cold enough to cut glass, "you are under arrest." The troopers moved swiftly. Marston sputtered, trying to form excuses, but his words tangled into incoherent denial. Reeve was shoved against the wall and cuffed. Mendez stepped aside voluntarily, expression heavy with guilt, but also relief. As Marston was dragged out, Ethan finally allowed himself a slow breath. The cold room no longer felt suffocating. Justice had arrived, and Shadow's silent oath had been heard. The storm had finally broken. Morning slid across Cold River in pale ribbons of silver, the kind of winter light that made the world look fragile but newly washed, as though every rooftop had been dipped in liquid pearl. Snow dripped slowly from the eaves of shuttered stores and homes, forming delicate icicles that glittered like suspended stars. The suffocating heaviness that had hung over the town for years, sharpened by fear, thickened by the corruption of a man who'd believed himself untouchable, seemed to melt with the last remnants of frost. Ethan Brooks drove into town with Shadow sitting tall in the passenger seat, the dog's breath fogging gently against the glass, leaving crescent-shaped patches of warmth. Shadow seemed calmer today, his coat brushed smooth and his ears relaxed rather than lifted in constant alertness. Still, the dog's sharp amber eyes scanned the surroundings instinctively. Ethan rested one gloved hand on Shadow's shoulder as he steered with the other. "Easy," he murmured. "It's over now." The truth was, Ethan wasn't entirely sure if anything was ever over. Peace felt strange, too light, too unguarded. Men who lived long enough in the shadows rarely trusted the quiet, but as he turned onto Main Street, he saw something that settled the uneasy rhythm of his heartbeat. Life. People were outside, actually outside, bundled in thick coats, wool scarves, knitted hats, their faces no longer tightened in suspicion or fear. A woman swept snow from her storefront with almost cheerful vigor, clad in a powder blue parka and wearing mittens 5 sizes too big. A man in his 60s with a bushy white beard cleared ice from his truck bed, pausing only to wave at Ethan's vehicle as it passed. Even children, though few, peeked through frosted windows, drawn by the bright echo of freedom they barely understood. Cold River, under a thin veil of winter dawn, felt reborn. When Ethan parked outside the diner, he noticed the absence first. There was no patrol cruiser parked diagonally across 3 spots, no officers leaning arrogantly beside its hood. Only normal vehicles, aging sedans, a blue pickup with peeling paint, a station wagon dusted so heavily with snow it resembled a loaf of powdered bread. Shadow leaped down lightly from the truck and stood beside Ethan, posture proud, tail sweeping the air in slow arcs. Together they approached the diner, where the windows glowed with soft yellow light, a beacon in the fading cold. Ethan pushed open the door, and the brass bell chimed, a familiar sound, but today it carried warmth rather than tension. Inside, conversation washed over them like a tide. The murmur of voices, the laughter that bubbled without restraint, the clatter of plates, sounds that had been absent the last time Ethan walked in. As soon as the door shut behind him, the noise stilled, but not with fear, with recognition. Sarah Nolan was the first to step forward. She wore a deep berry sweater beneath her apron, her auburn hair pulled loosely into a braid that fell over her shoulder. Her fair skin, usually flushed from the griddle's heat, now held a natural glow. Her hazel eyes brightened as she approached, and despite the tension etched deep from years of living under Marston's shadow, she smiled, truly smiled. "You came back," she said softly, though the words trembled slightly with emotion. Ethan inclined his head. "One last time." Before she could respond, a small shuffle of movement swept through the room. Walter Briggs, dressed in a thick charcoal coat and sporting a neatly knitted scarf, pushed himself carefully from his booth. Despite the fall he had endured, he seemed more upright today, steadier, shoulders straighter. He approached Ethan with the dignity of a man reclaiming the pieces of himself he'd long been forced to hide. "Son," Walter said, voice gravelly but firm, "you gave this town its spine back." Ethan opened his mouth to dismiss the praise, but Walter raised one trembling hand. "Let us thank you." As if summoned, the townspeople, one by one, stood, a middle-aged couple near the counter, a teenager refilling sugar jars, a man with a patched green hunting jacket, a baker with flour streaks still dusting his sleeves. Each person stepped forward or placed a hand to their chest, offering gratitude in their own quiet way. Shadow, sensing the shift in mood, sat tall beside Ethan, his ears pricking gently as strangers greeted him with reverent nods. Sarah brushed her hands over her apron. "Sit wherever you like," she said, though her voice thickened with warmth. "Coffee's on the house. Breakfast, too." Ethan shook his head lightly. "You don't owe me anything." But Sarah replied with a firmness that surprised even her. "Maybe not. but we want to give it, and that makes all the difference. Ethan found himself guided to a booth, not the one Marston had claimed, but one beside the window, where light streamed in and cast long golden stripes across the table. Sarah brought him a fresh cup of coffee, steam curling upward like a soft winter ghost. Shadow received a plate of scrambled eggs and sausage links placed on the floor with care, courtesy of Tom Berenger, the diner's cook, a burly man in his 50s with a salt and pepper beard, tanned skin from years of outdoor work, and quiet eyes that now held gratitude rather than guardedness. Tom gave a curt nod, one professional acknowledging another. As Ethan ate, people came to speak to him, gently, respectfully. Some shared short stories of how Marston had hurt them or threatened them. Others simply said thank you. The most touching came from Lydia Hartman, a woman in her early 30s with warm brown skin, thick curly hair tucked beneath a knitted cap, and a serene, grateful smile. She was the town librarian, her soft-spoken nature often mistaken for weakness. She placed a small wrapped parcel. Before him, a hand-bound notebook, its cover decorated with pressed pine needles sealed beneath resin. "For your road," she said, "because people like you shouldn't leave empty-handed." Ethan accepted the gift with a nod that meant more than words. Despite the warmth blossoming in the diner, Ethan felt the slow tug of the horizon, the road calling him the way it always did. He finished his meal, placed a generous tip under his cup, and rose from the booth. Shadow rose as well, stretching his long limbs with a low, contented rumble in his chest. As Ethan approached the door, people instinctively formed a path for him, not out of fear, out of respect, out of recognition. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward once more. "Where will you go?" she asked gently. Ethan rested a hand on Shadow's head. "Wherever we're needed," he said with the faintest glimmer of a smile. Outside, the wind had softened. Snow shimmered under the winter dawn, and the world felt as though it were exhaling. Ethan opened the truck door, and Shadow hopped in with swift ease. Before climbing inside, Ethan glanced back. The entire diner had spilled onto the sidewalk. Walter Briggs stood front and center, hand pressed to his chest. Tom folded his thick arms solemnly. Lydia waved softly. Sarah's eyes shone with unspoken gratitude. Ethan lifted 2 fingers from the truck door in a silent farewell. Then he spoke to his dog. "Let's go, old friend. Somewhere out there, justice is waiting." The engine rumbled to life, steady and sure. As the pickup rolled away from Cold River, tire tracks stitching into fresh snow, the town seemed to stand a little taller. The dawn glowed brighter, and Ethan Brooks, with Shadow by his side, vanished into the open road, leaving behind a place no longer ruled by fear, but by the fragile promise of hope. In a world that can feel cold and uncertain, this story reminds us that courage isn't always loud. It's the quiet decision to do what's right, even when no one is watching. And just like the people of Cold River, we all have the power to bring warmth back into the places that have forgotten it. If this story inspired you or touched your heart, let your voice be part of its journey. Like to show your support, share to spread the message. Comment with your thoughts or experiences. Subscribe for more stories of courage, hope, and the bond that carries us through the storm. Thank you for being here. Your presence keeps these stories alive.